So what are the soldier flies and allies? Well, look at that amazing display of wonderful flies. Basically, I could just stop talking here and we could sit and admire them for the rest of the evening, but there are 11 different families within the soldier flies and allies group. And as you might expect, the family with the largest number of species within that group is the soldier flies themselves. But the other fairly large families are the horseflies, robberflies, snipe flies, stiletto flies, and bee flies, all of which have at least 10 species in them. And then there are the remaining families all have just a few species in them. And one of the, I suppose, slight difficulties about soldier flies and allies as a group is that I can't really give you any good pointers as to how to recognize that you're looking at a fly in this group. There's very little common ground between these 11 families, and just looking at them on the screen there, I think you can see that they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. There's a lot of ecological variation as well. Some of them are predators, some of them are herbivores, some of them have a parasitic lifestyle. So they really are a very varied group, and I think that is one of the fascinating things about them. In taxonomic terms, they are considered to be a closely related set of families. The exact sort of ordering of the taxonomy and how closely related they are considered to be has varied over the years, but they have remained a sort of recognizable group somewhere in the middle of the Diptera classification. Altogether in the UK, we have about 158 species, depending on whether you count one or two ones that have a somewhat dubious claim to be on the British list. But it's that sort of order of magnitude. So it's quite a nice group to get to grips with. And once again, you can see the families listed here with the number of species in each of those families. And although I said that the group as a whole is quite difficult to recognize as an entire group, there's no one distinguishing feature that means you're looking at a soldier fly or an ally. Each of those individual families is reasonably distinctive, I think. And once you start to get your eye in for the different families, you can often quite quickly get to the point where you can recognize something as being a horsefly or a robberfly or at that family level. Getting down to species can be a little bit harder, of course, but there are some quite distinct, just the way the flies appear are quite distinct for quite a lot of the species within those individual families. So we'll have a look at a few examples from the largest families to start us off with, and starting with the soldier flies themselves. The example I'm showing you on screen here is not a particularly brightly coloured soldier fly, but many of them are brightly coloured. Some are quite metallic, some of them have black and yellow stripes and can be confused with hoverflies on the basis of their colours. They tend to have quite a broad, flat abdomen. There are exceptions to that, but a lot of soldier flies, including the one shown here, do have that rather broad and flattened shape to them. One of the things that does distinguish the soldier flies from the hoverflies is the wing venation. Hoverfly wing venation does look quite different to soldier flies, and one of the distinctive features for most soldier flies is that they do have this rather small discal cell, that sort of almost circular cell right in the middle of the wing. And beyond the discal cell, the venation is often quite weak and almost invisible, as is shown here, whereas with hoverflies, you can see strong veins running almost to the edge of the wing. A lot of soldier flies are associated with wetlands, and they like really high quality wetlands, and they are very good indicators of particular habitat conditions. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But there are some species that are widespread and that are found in gardens. The larvae of soldier flies are herbivores and detritivores, and the garden ones are capable of breeding in compost heaps or pretty much anywhere where there's a bit of decaying vegetation for some of the most widespread species. This is the most frequently seen soldier fly, and the soldier fly that has the most records in the recording scheme, the broad Centurion, Chloromyia formosa. And it is a rather lovely metallic colour, slightly different colours between the males on the left and the female shown on the right here. And you can also see, if you look at the eyes, that the male and female have the eyes arranged slightly differently in a similar way to many hoverflies, so that the male on the left, the eyes meet on top of the head, whereas the female on the right has that gap between the eyes, and you can see the shiny surface of the head appearing between the eyes in the female. That doesn't work for all the species in the Soldierflies and Allies group, but it does follow that pattern for several of them. While we're talking about the eyes, the other thing that hopefully you can see in the left-hand picture is that the eyes appear rather fuzzy, and that's because they have a lot of little hairs sticking out of them, and that's a good distinctive feature for this particular Soldierfly, the broad Centurion. There are some other Soldierflies that have hairs as well, but the general appearance and colour of this one, and plus those characteristic hairs on the eyes, do allow you to pick this one out quite easily. This one is one of the ones that you can find in gardens and will breed in gardens, and the adults are often found sitting on flowers. Another good distinction with hoverflies actually is the way that they behave around flowers, because if you're at all familiar with hoverflies, you'll be familiar with the idea that they hover, obviously, and they tend to zap around at quite a fast rate and go from one flower to another quite quickly. Whereas hoverflies are, I guess, somewhat lazy creatures from that perspective. They like to sit still a lot of the time, and when they do fly, it's nothing like that fast hovering flight of the hoverflies. So they're much more laid back creatures, and that can be a really good clue that you're looking at a Soldierfly rather than a hoverfly when you see one in the field. Just to say something about the English names, such as this broad Centurion, when Alan Stubbs wrote his wonderful book on Soldierflies and Allies quite a while ago now, he invented basically English names for all the species that didn't have one, and he's come up with some really inventive names. So all the Soldierflies have these sort of slightly military names attached to them, which are all good fun. Here's a couple more examples of some rather more brightly coloured Soldierflies with these lovely wasp mimic type markings. Again, you could confuse them with hoverflies, but the wing venation is different, the behaviour is different, and really that sort of broadened shape with the wings held tightly over each other over the abdomen is all sort of quite distinctive for the Soldierflies. And these are quite small species, the two that we're looking at here. So they're sort of, well, under a centimetre long, each of these. So you do have to look quite closely to see some of these creatures. But when you do get a good close-up view of them, as you can see, they are really quite spectacular creatures. Why they're called Soldierflies is a question that comes up sometimes, and it's a question that's a little bit difficult to answer. There's no definitive answer to it, but the theories are that the fact that they have these sort of stripy markings perhaps looks a bit like a military uniform is one of the theories that's put forward. And you might just be able to see on the pictures here that there are some spines on this scutellum, this little bit at the back of the thorax. Quite often has spines on it for quite a lot of the Soldierfly species, and that again gives the idea of an insect that is armoured in some way or is militaristic in some way, and I think that is probably where the name for the group came from. Not all Soldierflies fit that typical pattern, and there is a group of them related to this Pachygaster species that are these rather sort of dumpy shape and dark colours and really quite tiny, and until you know what you're looking for would be very easy not to realise that they're Soldierflies at all. But one or two of these species are really quite widespread and again do turn up in gardens, such as the dark-winged black at the top of the picture here. And then there are some rather similar rarer species. The one in the bottom left corner, the scarce black, is associated with mature trees and is very rarely recorded. The picture at the bottom there showing these identification features for the two species is one of the resources that's available on the Recording Scheme website, and we'll say a bit more about that later on as well. Moving on to the next largest family, the horseflies, which tend to have a somewhat mixed reputation amongst, well, entomologists, let alone amongst the wider public. Some horseflies are, of course, well known for having a fairly nasty bite to them. The clegs are one of the horsefly group, and they are not the most popular insect amongst many people, and indeed I don't particularly like getting bitten by them myself. But they do play a very important ecological role. Their larvae are predators, usually in ditches or in wet mud situations at the edge of water bodies. The adult flies do play a role in pollination, and of course they can be prey for many other predatory creatures. So they do, of course, as with pretty much all life, do play a role in those sort of wider ecosystem situations. And they're also fascinating to look at in many ways. They have these amazing eye patterns, which can help with the identification, or at least to narrow down the identification. And some of them really are like the chrysops species in the bottom right-hand corner here. Some of them really are quite amazing patterns and colours. It is in fact only the female horseflies that will bite you or bite other mammals, because they are seeking a blood meal to gain the protein resources that they need to mature their eggs before they can lay their eggs. So male horseflies are perfectly harmless to us and to other mammals, and are more often seen sitting on flowers and feeding on nectar. There's quite a lot of similar species in the horsefly family. As you can see from this selection here, most of them do have a similar shape and this mixture of brownish and greyish colours to them. So apart from the eye patterns, there's often, it can be quite hard to distinguish them. And although a lot of the Soldierflies group as a whole can be identified from photos, the horseflies do present quite a challenge. And for some of them, there's no getting around the fact that you do need to have a specimen and closely examine it to work out exactly what it is. A lot of them, well, I was going to say, a few of them are quite widespread and will be seen in lots of different places, but quite a lot of the horseflies are much more specialised in their habitat requirements, and that again can help narrow down the identification possibilities when you're looking at them. One horsefly that's been of particular interest to the Tanyptera project is this Cheshire horsefly, for obvious reasons. It is associated with the county of Cheshire, and in recent times it has only been found in Cheshire. And when the Northwest Invertebrates project was starting up, it was realised that there hadn't actually been any records of this species since the 1990s. And a survey was commissioned from Andy Grayson, who's the real expert on horseflies in this country, to see if this species could be found again. It was known from just a handful of locations within the Cheshire mosses. There's an older record from some of the Shropshire mosses as well, but certainly the only ones that are at all recent have been from Cheshire. So Andy went out and looked for this species in 2018. And his report is, I believe, available on the Tanyptera Trust website. And Andy found some specimens of the Cheshire horsefly, the first ones for about 20 years, well, over 20 years, I think it was by that point, which was really good news that this species is still surviving in these amazing floating blanket bog type habitats in the Cheshire mosses. Andy used a particular technique that's sort of quite well known for catching horseflies, and that's this thing on the right here that's called a Manitoba trap. And I don't know whether you can see very clearly in the photo, but in the middle of that trap, there's a large black inflated rubber ball, which hangs in the middle of the trap. It heats up in the sunshine, and basically it's an imitation large mammal. It's a warm body sitting in the bog, awaiting flies to come and investigate whether it's good to eat. And of course the horseflies fly in to investigate, and then they fly up into the funnel trap there. And this has long been recognised as a technique for catching horseflies, and in some situations, such as around stables, it is actually used as a means of controlling the horseflies and keeping their numbers down, but it's also a useful technique for surveying for them. And this was one of the techniques that Andy used to find, to rediscover the Cheshire horsefly. So Andy managed to reconfirm it from the 2 sites at which it had been most recently recorded in the past, and also find it from a 3rd site. And Gary was telling me earlier on this evening that he's been back in 2019 and found some more of them at least a couple of these sites. So that's, as I say, good news. It does seem to be holding on still in this very restricted area and very dependent on these special habitats, but it's good that it's still there. There's been some interesting research done on horseflies and zebras, and there does seem to be some quite convincing evidence that a prime reason for the fact that zebras have developed stripes is to try and keep the horseflies away from them. And there's this lovely research paper that was published in 2019 that carried out some fascinating experiments on this. And if you look at the image on the left, one of the things that they did was to use video cameras to track the behavior of horseflies around horses and around zebras. And hopefully you can just about pick out the red traces that they've sort of taken from the videos, showing how the horseflies approached the animals and how much time they spent flying around and landing on the animals. And it does seem that they spend a lot more time on non-striped horses than they do on striped zebras. And then they carried out a lovely little experiment that must have been great fun to do, whereby they took some plain coloured horses that weren't striped and covered them with sort of coats, basically, a dark coloured coat, a pale coloured coat, and a stripy coat. And the graph here, the top one, shows the number of horseflies that actually touched the cloth on the horses. So there were lots on the dark, lots on the pale, far fewer on the stripy. Likewise, there were quite a lot that landed on the dark, lots that landed on the pale, very few landed on the stripy coat. But as a sort of cross-check, they also checked how many landed on the head of the horse, which was not covered with the stripy coat, and the head did not seem to receive any protection, even though the body of the horse was covered with the stripes. So again, that did seem to be some quite intriguing and convincing evidence that the stripes have an effect on how horseflies perceive the animal and how easily they find to approach and land on it. And there's been some other research done along these lines as well, but yeah, I always find that quite an amusing and interesting outcome. Okay, let's move on to our next family, the robberflies. And robberflies get their name, they don't actually steal from each other, but they are quite voracious predators. So in that sense, they are quite sort of threatening, if you like. Predators of other insects in this case. They're not looking for mammals to bite or suck blood, but they are quite voracious predators of other insects, including ones that are as large or even larger than they are. So some of them will quite happily capture quite large grasshoppers and even bees and wasps. They have a fairly distinct proboscis. If you look closely at them, it's not a very long proboscis, but usually on a robberfly you can see that it's got a reasonably sharp proboscis sticking out from under its head. And some of them at least do have some really strong venom within their mouth parts that they use to subdue their prey. And that is an area of research also at the moment, looking at the properties of robberfly venoms and seeing whether there are any sort of medical uses to which they can be put, and some interesting results coming from that. The one we're looking at here is called the kite-tailed robberfly, and it's the one that is probably the most widespread and most frequently seen. And the kite tail name refers to that little extension which is underneath the abdomen. It only appears in the males of this species. And if you get the right view of it, and it's not always very easy to see, but if you get the right view of it, it does have a sort of tapered bit on either side that, with enough imagination, matches the shape of the tail of the red kite or other kite birds. And that is where the name for this one came from. There's a number of closely related species in this genus, and they are quite tricky to tell apart. You have to get some really good views of different angles, particularly showing things like the leg colours and colours of the bristles on the head. The males are a bit easier to tell apart than the females, which don't have this kite tail extension, but there are some tricky ones there. And if you go to the Recording Scheme website, you can download a paper by Malcolm Smart, who's a real authority on this family, and he produced a paper trying to help distinguish some of these very closely similar species. The three examples here, the one that we were just looking at, the kite-tailed robberfly, is on the left, and as I say, is quite widespread and common. The one in the middle, the brown Heath robberfly, is also quite widespread, but more restricted to sandy habitats, usually, not always, and less frequently seen. The one on the right, again, is of potential interest to the northwest invertebrates area, because the Pygmy Soldierfly, the Irish robberfly, has long been known from Ireland and has also been found on the Isle of Man for quite a long time. But in fairly recent times, it was also discovered on the Cumbrian coast, just around Morecambe Bay. And it's still not known from very many records there, but it has been seen over a number of years now. And it would be fascinating to get some more information about exactly how widespread it is and how it's making use of those habitats. Quite a tricky one to identify from its commoner relatives, so it does need a really sort of close look and probably the occasional specimen taking to be absolutely sure of them, but it is one that would be interesting to investigate further. Why it's got such a Western-oriented distribution is another question that I don't have a good answer to. Another robberfly, unfortunately, doesn't make its way as far north as Cheshire and Lancashire, but it is a very spectacular species that is one of those sort of, I suppose, one of the most charismatic species, if you like, amongst the Soldierflies group. It's a very large robberfly. It does have these spectacular hornet mimic colours to it. Its behaviour is amazing to watch. It is one of the sort of largest predators in the group, and it zaps around at very high speed. It seems to almost magically disappear from one place and reappear in another place almost instantaneously. It's a really spectacular thing to see. It was feared to be declining, and certainly has declined in parts of its range, particularly on the eastern side and East Anglia. But in recent years, it has been recorded quite well, and the numbers of records coming in are quite encouraging. The life history is still not entirely known, but it does seem to be associated with dung, and the larvae of the hornet robberfly are predators of other creatures that have larvae that feed on dung. So it's not a direct relationship in the dung, but in these wonderful photos by David Williams that were taken quite close to me on a nature reserve in Buckinghamshire, you can see in the top left corner there, that's a female who does appear to be ovipositing the eggs into this particular dung patch. One of the concerns over this species was the use of veterinary chemicals such as avermectins that are used to worm cattle and other livestock and do kill a lot of the invertebrate fauna in the dung. And that then has a knock-on effect that knocks out the other species that are associated with the dung fauna, such as the hornet robberfly. And that certainly does seem to have had an impact on them in some areas at some times. But as I say, at the moment, it does seem to be doing reasonably well within its current range. But if you ever get a chance to go and look for one of these, it is a fantastic thing to see. Final robberfly I wanted to show you is one that would be worth looking out for in the not too distant future. This is one of the early flying species that starts up in April, and it's quite widespread but quite localized and really restricted to sandy habitats. So heathlands and sand dunes are the places to look for this fly. But there's not much else that looks like it at that early time of the year. It's quite a small robberfly, but it has that typical elongated shape and some quite distinctive features to it, even though it's an all dark species. And it would be certainly one that I would encourage you to go out and look for if you have sandy habitats near you. And I was pleased to see that in this year some records were added from the sand dunes at Formby Point by Philip Smith, and it does seem to be maintaining a population on the Sefton coast there. So that nicely fills in that blue dot, which will now turn orange the next time we update the maps. Okay, the final family, just have a quick look at from amongst the larger families in the group, are the snipe flies in family Regionidae. And these are not really very widely known if you're not into your flies and into your entomology. They don't seem to have sort of got out into the public consciousness to any great extent, but I find them really quite charming creatures. They all have, they're not quite as elongated as robberflies, but they mostly have a relatively elongated body, relatively broad wings, and relatively long spindly legs, which are beautifully modelled here by this little snipe fly. Very little is known about the ecology of most of these species. We don't have a very good idea of what their larvae do, although they're believed to live in the soil. And the adults don't seem to do much in the way of feeding either. You don't often find them on flowers. They don't seem to be active predators. So they're a bit of a mystery from the ecological side of things, but some of them are very widespread. Others are much more restricted. Quite a small family and relatively easy to get to grips with their identification. Another common species in the family is the downlooker snipefly, so called because it does characteristically sit with its head down, as shown in the photo here, usually on tree trunks or fence posts or those sorts of places. The mottled markings on the wings are one of the distinctive features for this species. There is one other snipefly that has mottled markings, but it's pretty much restricted to chalk downland in the south, in parts of the Chilterns and Surrey. So outside those areas, you're very unlikely to see a mottled wing snipefly that isn't this one. And reasonably large snipefly, this one. It's over 1 centimetre long, so it is one you can observe quite readily and get photos of without too much difficulty. Okay, so those were just 4 of the larger families within the 11 families as a whole, and I'm now going to move on to talk a little bit about the recording scheme. So the recording scheme, which used to be called the larger Brachycera recording scheme, and larger Brachycera is just one of the terms that used to be used for this group of 11 families. And it started back in 1976, and a number of people have been involved with running the scheme over the years. I've been doing so since about 2013, I think it was, I got involved with it. And a number of people are helping me run the scheme, so I am able to call on the expertise of people like Andy Grayson and Malcolm Smart, and a number of people, including some of the people whose names I notice on the webinar this evening, are helping me with some of the verification on iRecord. And we had a good team of people, for instance, helping with the bee fly recording in the spring, which I'll come back to a bit later. Martin Drake, who was one of the previous organisers of the scheme, produced a provisional atlas in 1991, and that atlas is still available and can be downloaded, and was based on the 21,000 records available at that time. We do now have a lot more records, as you would expect, in the years that have accumulated since. And at the beginning of 2018, I produced an updated atlas, which has not been published in paper form, but is available to download from the Recording Scheme website. And the maps that I've been showing you with those blue and orange dots on them are from that new atlas. The graph here is showing the number of records that have been coming in via the iRecord system, which is our sort of preferred way of records coming in, but we do get records via other routes as well. So the numbers shown on this chart are not the whole story by any means, but nonetheless it's pleasing to see that the level of recording has been increasing in recent years, and that we are getting better data on many of the species. We do, of course, as I've mentioned, have a Recording Scheme website. There's quite a lot of information on here now, and it builds up over time. So that's certainly the place to go if you want to find out more and to see the information about the identification guides that are available, and to download the atlas and so on. We produce an annual newsletter that goes out with the Dipteris Forum bulletin and can also be downloaded from the website. And I'm just about to put together the one for next spring. So if anybody's got any exciting or interesting, doesn't have to be exciting necessarily, interesting to you information about soldier flies and their allies that you'd like to put into the newsletter, now would be a very good time to get in touch. In terms of identifying soldier flies, there is a fantastic book that covers the entire British fauna, written by Alan Stubbs and Martin Drake. The current version is the second edition. It's still available from the British Entomological and Natural History Society. If you're a member of that society or of Dipteris Forum, you get a substantial discount on it. And it is a fantastic book. It has full identification keys and lots of illustrations for all the adult flies. It also has keys to a lot of the larval and early stages and a wealth of information about the ecology of the species and where you can find them. We've produced a set of notes that are available on the website which expand on the identification keys. There's very few errors in the keys, but there are some places where it's easy to go wrong, and we've tried to provide some additional information about that on the website. And the other fantastic resource that has become available in recent years are the wonderful collections of photos that Stephen Falk has put onto his Flickr site. And I'm sure that most, if not all of you, are very familiar with Stephen Falk's work, but he has covered the entire Soldierflies and Allies group very, very well. And it is a fantastic resource to have in addition to these, the keys and other things that are available. Recently, and with a lot of help from Stephen Falk and other photographers, I've started compiling some illustrated photo guides to identification. We haven't covered all the species yet. We may not ever cover all the species in this way because some of them cannot be identified safely from photos, but we are fortunate within the Soldierflies group that a lot of them can be identified, at least from a good photo, or if you have photos from several angles. And these identification guides have been put together with the idea that they will help people identify things from photos or in the field. And just one more example, this is one of the soldier flies, the twin spot Centurion. This is actually the soldier fly that flies latest in the year. Normally they fly into November, but when I logged into iRecord the other day, I noticed that somebody's put in a record for the 1st of December this year. And I think I'm right in saying that's the first time we've ever had an adult soldier fly recorded in December. So that was quite an amazing record. Who knows whether they could still even be found now. It's we've not had a lot of really cold weather in certainly not in my part of the country, and maybe we could extend that date even further. But anyway, if you would like to make use of these photo ID guides, and I hope you will, they are all available again on the Recording Scheme website. And once again, I'll say a very big thank you to Malcolm Story and Stephen Falk and many other photographers who've allowed me to use their images to put these together. And once you've identified your soldier flies, the thing to do is to send the record in. And as I mentioned, we do take records in via iRecord. You can also send them in spreadsheets and via other routes there, but iRecord is the quickest way of getting them into the system. And it does enable us to share the data with local record centres and the NBN Atlas very quickly and easily as well. And as you can see, the records have been building up in recent years and covering many of the species in the group now. Nearly 20,000 photos as well. That's an enormous contribution to getting the records checked and verified. We've seen some examples from the Atlas, but I thought I'd just show these couple of summary maps as well. So this is showing the number of records per 10 kilometres square at the end of 2017. And you can see the coverage is quite good in terms of there being at least one record per square. We do still have some gaps, particularly in Scotland. But a lot of those squares are still in the 1 to 50 records category, which is not an awful lot of records, really. And it would be lovely to increase that as we are beginning to do. And this map shows the species richness per 10 kilometre square, which to some extent, as you might expect, reflects the amount of recording that's been done in those squares, but I think it generally does pick out some hotspots for the group as well, many of which are in the south. Like a lot of insect groups, the warm conditions in the south do favour some of the species, but there are specialists of northern conditions and habitats as well, and particularly the red hotspot in Scotland is around the Abernethy Forest area, which does have a number of species that you can't really see anywhere else. So wherever you are in the country, there is a good range of species that you could potentially find. A number of local atlases and lists have been produced in recent years, and I must mention Phil Brighton's excellent summary of the soldier flies and allies in Lancashire and Cheshire in the context this evening, and that's a really good guide to those two counties. But as I say, a number of other ones have come out in one form or another in recent years, and they all help to give a really detailed picture of what's going on around the country. Next, I wanted to say a little bit about the places to go to look for soldier flies and what habitats they occur in. And this is a very broad summary of where the different species are found. A lot of them are found in, well, I say in woodland. That, of course, hides quite a lot of complexity in how they use the woodland habitat. And as with quite a lot of insect groups, you tend to get most of the soldier flies group that are associated with woodlands are mostly associated, or mostly found at least, around the edges of woodlands and in the rides and clearings, and associated with nice scrubby edges to woodland. There are some species that are associated with mature trees and decaying wood. Some of them have larvae that develop in decaying wood, so some of them really are ancient woodland linked creatures, or at least ancient tree linked creatures. But there's a good range of species that can be found in woodland. Then there's a lot associated with wetland, particularly amongst the soldier flies, but a lot of the horse flies are wetland associates as well. Good range of grassland species, and then sandy soils, heathland, and some of the coastal habitats support a lot of species. Some of the larvae that aren't in water are often in soil within this group, and some of them are specialists of these sandy soils. So heathy and some of the sandy coastal habitats do hold species that you won't find anywhere else. And then, as you can see, there's a range of other habitats that do support at least a few species. I'm not going to go through all these habitats, but I thought it'd be nice to pick out a few examples. And there's a really nice example in one of the groups of robberflies in genus Dioptera, where there are a range of species, all of which have slightly different preferences in the way they use their woodland habitat, or at least the edge of the woodland. That is where you tend to find them. So starting with the violet black-legged robberfly, this one is typically found in low vegetation in grassland and can be quite right out in the open. It's not particularly associated so much with woodland, this one. Moving up into the taller vegetation and the beginnings of the scrub up to about 1 metre or so above the ground, you can find the red-legged robberfly. So these are all species in this same genus Dioptera. The small yellow-legged robberfly moves up a little bit further into the scrub and the lower parts of the trees. Then typically the striped-legged robberfly is about 1.5 metres above the ground. And the orange-legged robberfly, which is the scarcest of these, the other four are quite widespread, but the orange-legged is quite a scarce species. But that's generally found above 2 metres, and part of the reason for its scarcity may be that we're just not very good at looking for it at that height. So there's some really interesting sort of tendencies for these species to use different parts of the habitat there. But this does come with a health warning that the species don't always follow the rules, of course, and you can't measure how high your robberfly is and use that as a safe way of identifying it, for instance, and you will find them doing unexpected things. But I do find it fascinating that you can pick out sometimes these different behavioural categories and different the way they partition their habitats into slightly different uses. Another habitat that supports several of the species in this group are the sorts of sediments and shingles that you get along river corridors, particularly in calcareous areas for some of the species. And here's another species that has a real potential link to Cheshire, Lancashire, but as you can see, it's found in a wide, quite locally in a number of other areas as well, but it's always associated with these similar sorts of river habitats. Just over 10 years ago, a detailed report was done on this particular stiletto fly within Cheshire. Steve Hewitt and John Parker did a very extensive survey and put a lot of work into trying to define the habitat clearly and work out exactly where the species was breeding. So that's a really useful report to read up on to learn about this species and how to find it. More recently, Nigel Jones took that information and put it to good use in Shropshire and targeted some of these likely looking river sediment habitats to see if he could find the species, and was successful in doing so. It's not terribly clear on screen here, but the top left picture actually shows that very long, narrow larva that lives in this sort of very sandy, rather friable soil just above the edges of the water there. Quite an attractive fly when it emerges as an adult. Where it's breeding, the larvae are actually probably easier to find than the adults are. They seem to be a little bit elusive sometimes, but it is a species that you have to target to go and find, but it's well worth looking for if you know of suitable looking habitat. And we mentioned that quite a lot of species, particularly in the soldier flies and horseflies, are associated with wetlands. And these are just a couple of photos of some wetland conditions at one of the Oxfordshire fenland sites that Judy Webb has been doing some fantastic work to look at the breeding localities for some of our rarer soldier flies and horseflies. And the wetland features that are really, really good for a lot of these species include having a calcareous influence, so having some sort of chalk or limestone influence affecting the water that comes into these wetlands. Having areas of shallow water and seepages and springs where you get this shallow layer of water that can warm up and allow the larvae to develop more quickly is very important. And there's a particular type of habitat associated with some of these conditions that's known as tufa, which I'll come back to in a second. So this is Cothill Fen in Oxfordshire, and this is just one example of some of the work that Judy has been doing to actually find where the larvae are and to rear them through and work out their life histories and exactly which species are using which conditions. And Judy's made some fantastic progress with this, breeding out some very rare species and learning more about them. So this is the orange-horned green kernel, which, as you can see from the map, is very restricted in its distribution. And Judy's successfully managed to rear this from larvae and to then observe the adults laying eggs. It's really adding to our knowledge of what this species does. And she's done that for a number of other species as well. And the tufa is a condition that you get where water that has a calcareous influence emerges from the ground and starts to deposit those calcium carbonate minerals as the water comes out of the ground. And that's a similar sort of process. So when you get limescale in a kettle or something where the water is depositing that sort of calcareous deposit, and it produces a wonderfully sort of interesting moist habitat that a lot of soldier flies really like. And these photos were some that Liam Olds took, I think it was earlier this year that he circulated these round. Some fantastic photos from Liam from a site in South Wales where you can see that sort of white covering on the ground is where these tufa deposits have come from the water that's emerging here. And the Pygmy Soldierfly in this case was laying her eggs directly into the tufa deposit and into some of the dead bits of vegetation in amongst it. And if you get your eye in for looking for this particular microhabitat, it can be absolutely fantastic for finding some of these more restricted soldierfly species. Looking for the larvae and learning what the larvae are doing, of course, is a very important part of the ecology of the species. And I'm very pleased that there are a number of people now who are taking up an interest in this. It's something we've started to try and build up some resources for on the website. There are, as I say, some keys in Alan Stubbs' books to the larvae, but they're still sometimes quite hard to identify. So we're trying to build up the resources for that, and also to gain from the knowledge of the people who are trying to rear these creatures as to how best to do it and how you can provide the conditions and work out what's going on with them. So we've got some examples here for various of the Soldierfly larvae, and bottom right here, the common Allfly, which is one from one of the families we haven't discussed today. And if anybody is involved in doing this sort of thing or has an interest in looking at the larvae, then again, I'd be delighted to hear from you. And if we've got any more photos or tips and techniques that we can add to the website to encourage others to get involved, it really would be adding valuable knowledge to what we know about the species in this group and how to conserve their habitats. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end of the talk now, but I couldn't leave it without talking about Beefly Watch, which is a project that we run or have done since 2016 now, to encourage people to get interested in bee flies. And it focuses on the two bee fly species that fly early in the spring. So on the top right here, we have a rather wonderful photo of Chloe Wrench, eye to eye with the dark-edged bee fly, which is the common and widespread species, and Penny Green on the left-hand side here, delighted to encounter the dotted bee fly, which is the one that's a bit more restricted to the south. And this is a very informal project. We just promote it via Twitter and Facebook, but a lot of people get a real enjoyment out of looking out for the first bee fly of the year and watching them. They're amazing creatures to watch. They have interesting behavior. They have quite a macabre lifestyle because they lay their eggs into solitary bee burrows, and the larvae of the bee fly then basically feed on the larvae and the provisions that the bee has put into her burrow. So there is that sort of dark side to them, but they're fascinating creatures to watch, and a lot of people love to do so. And over the years, this has built up. 2020, we had an enormous influx of records, which was no doubt influenced by people being stuck near to home during the lockdown period, but still able to get out and see bee flies in parks and gardens. So we've had a really good response this year. The orange bars here are the common species, the dark edge bee fly, and then the green is the dotted bee fly, which is much more restricted. So we get far fewer records of that. But even so, as you'll see, there's been some interesting results for both species. So this is the distribution. This is just the records for 2020 that we're looking at here as they came into iRecord, and the dark edge bee fly, as I say, is pretty much all over the country, more restricted in Scotland and really only in the lowland areas. But you can, to some extent, you get a nice pattern of the emergences moving from south to north as the spring goes on. And then the dotted bee fly, as I say, is much more restricted to the south and to some extent to the west, but it has been moving north quite significantly in recent years. It's been getting up into the Midlands, and this year, quite amazingly, that record popped up not too far from Sheffield in the Peak District, and that's an enormous jump north from where it's previously been known from, and quite how it got there and whether it's actually established a full population there. I think it was seen on more than one occasion, but it's really fascinating that it has turned up so much further north, and it does, of course, raise the question of whether it's going to continue this and spread even more to the north. So that again is definitely one to keep an eye out for in the Lancashire and Cheshire area. The other thing we look at is the phenology, the flight patterns of this. And I must first of all apologise for the complete colour confusion on these charts. I've managed to completely mismatch the colours and the years between the two different sets of data we're looking at here. But ignoring the bar chart in the middle and looking at the line charts on the left, we've got the common dark edge bee fly at the top and the dotted bee fly at the bottom. And if you look at the blue line, that's 2018, which was a rather late year, and bee flies didn't really get properly going until April. 2019 was completely different, and we had common bee flies coming out right early into February, which they'd never really done before. It was a very warm early spring in 2019, and the bee flies really responded to that. 2020, I'm afraid, should be more in the middle, really. It was a good spring for them. We had that wonderful sunny April period, and there was a really substantial peak in the middle, but the peak came sort of in the middle of what had happened in 2018 and 2019. So it's always interesting to see how the species respond, and the temperatures do seem to be a big part of this variation. And as I say, I haven't made it very easy for you to compare the temperatures between these two charts here, but it is the case that there were relatively cold temperatures in February and March in 2018, leading to that delayed emergence, as opposed to the much increased temperatures in 2019 in February and March. And it'll be fascinating to see, of course, what impact climate change has on this and how it might continue to change into the future. So that was Bee Fly Watch, which, as I say, focuses on those two common spring species, but there are a number of other bee fly species as well. And something that happened in 2016 was a quite exciting addition to the bee fly fauna in Britain. The photo here by Rob Mills was circulated by Rob on Twitter and caused a bit of excitement, and Stephen Falcon, myself and others got involved with it and got in touch with Rob. And this turns out to be a bee fly that had not previously been confirmed from Britain before. It's fairly widespread on the continent and was known to be moving north on the continent, and there's some old and unconfirmed records from the 1930s, but not ones that had ever been sort of reliably proven from this country. So this was quite a surprise. It turned up quite well inland in Cambridgeshire, in a garden in this sort of estate, which is, I guess, not what you consider to be prime wildlife habitat, but gardens can, of course, be very good for insects. This bee fly is a parasitoid of some of the hole nesting bees, mason bees generally, such as the red mason bee. And at least in Holland, it's been shown that it does very well out of people providing bee hotels for the bees to nest in, and the bee fly has then been able to follow along and take advantage of the bee nests. And that was indeed where Rob saw this one on a bee hotel in his garden. This fly goes under the rather alarming name of Anthrax anthrax, which refers back to a Greek word which basically means dark coloration, and the word anthracite for that type of coal derives from the same root. And the disease anthrax is so called because it produces dark boils on the skin. So the name of the bee fly doesn't refer to the disease, it refers to the dark colouring that underlies all these things. So we've christened this one the anthracite bee fly. And it is a rather handsome species. So Rob found it in 2016, but unfortunately I don't think he's ever seen it again. He certainly hasn't recorded it again since, and for a while it appeared that was just another peculiar one-off occurrence, and it wasn't seen anywhere in 2017. But then in 2018 there was another report by Michael Woods, who lives near Canterbury, and saw several in his garden, and he's now seen quite a lot more in 2019 and again in 2020. So it really does seem to be established in his area. As yet, nobody else has reported it at all, and I must admit I'm quite surprised. It's a relatively large and obvious looking fly, quite a dramatic looking fly really, and you might expect that if anybody was seeing it, it would get sort of picked up. But it's not happening yet, and it remains to be seen whether it really is going to get established and start spreading out more widely. And that's just one example of the last two examples I'm going to give you of the surprises that can happen if you go out and look for these creatures. The next one, well, perhaps surprise is the wrong word here, because this is something that has been a bit predictable in a way. There is a species called the black soldierfly, Hermetia illucens, which is not a native UK species, but for quite a long time now there have been people breeding it in Britain, because it is used for a number of interesting things. To some extent, the larvae are reared to use as pet food and feed to reptiles and so on. but it also seems to have a potentially very important role in recycling various forms of waste. The fly larvae will feed on the waste, and then the larvae themselves can be processed into food that can be used for animal feeding purposes. And there are now a number of companies who are working on this process and trying to find really sustainable ways of producing protein that will be more beneficial than some of the other practices that are used to feed livestock at the moment. So these have been in the news on and off for quite a while now, and I've been expecting the fly to be turning up from time to time, and it's taken a while to get there, but this year it's happened. Peter Duran in Wiltshire found this in his garden. It's not believed to be capable of surviving in UK conditions, although that remains to be seen. And it turns out that Peter wasn't entirely surprised to find it in his garden, because he had been feeding his local hedgehogs with the larvae of black soldier flies, which he'd, I think, been rearing himself. So it's an artificial introduction, if you like. But as far as I'm aware, this is the first free living example of black soldier fly in Britain. So that's a slightly unusual sort of artificial discovery. And the final example I'm going to give you, though, is a rather more natural and rather mystifying discovery. A typical robberfly we can see here with these wonderful orangey coloured legs. This is the Devon red-legged robberfly, so called because it was first discovered in 1990 on the South Devon coast, and has never been seen there again since. People have been back to look for it, and it was there in that year, has not been found anywhere else, has not known from any museum collections from any earlier time period. So what was going on there? Perhaps just a temporary introduction. But then in 2016, it popped up on a hillside in Shropshire. Long way from South Devon, no records in the gaps in between. Whether these two populations, if they are populations, have got anything to do with each other, or whether it's just two random colonization events, we don't know. You wouldn't really expect a new colonization to happen in Shropshire if it's a creature that's coming in from the continent, for instance. So it's a real mystery, this one. The habitat is actually quite similar in these two sites, in that it's an area of south-facing slope with a lot of bare ground and a sort of rocky substrate, and bits of grass growing around it. So there is some common ground there, but this was completely unexpected. And Nigel Jones was, I think, the first person to find it in Shropshire, and a number of other people have seen it at the same site, but it's still only known from that one site. So I always like to sort of show some of these examples of the complete surprising things that can happen if you go out and look for and record insects. There are real genuine discoveries to be made. And that brings me to the end of the talk. But hopefully, of course, not the end of your interest in soldier flies and their allies. There is a lot of good resources available nowadays, and we can offer help via Facebook and Twitter. And we would love to, if you are out seeing these insects, hopefully the first thing you'll do is enjoy seeing them. But if you can then also send your records in, that really does help us build up the picture of what's going on with these species. Dipteris Forum is an excellent society to join to find out more about flies in general, and we do run a number of training courses and events once life gets back to allowing us to do those sorts of things. So I'm very grateful to the Tanyptera Trust for allowing me to talk about soldier flies and their allies this evening, and of course a very big thank you to all the people who do send in records and allow me to share their photographs. And that brings me to the end of the presentation.
So I'll move on to questions now, if that's okay, Martin.
Yep, certainly.
So the first question from the chat is from David Lewis, saying, why do female flies have a gap between the eyes?
Okay, yes, that is a good question. I believe that in many cases it's because the male flies, well, either they tend to be the ones that are hunting out the females, so they need to have that very wide field of vision, But in a lot of cases, including some of the species in the Soldierflies group, there's also swarming behavior that goes on where there is a sort of very close interaction of individual flies, it's not always the males that swarm, but in some species it's the males that swarm. And my understanding is that the more extended eyes give them that slightly greater visual control over how they interact with other individuals. So that is my understanding. I would probably have to go back to my textbooks to give a more definitive answer. But
thank you. What is the ID difficulty scale? Is 4 too difficult?
Okay,
Carlos R.
Okay, I guess. Oh, that probably came from one of the maps in the atlas do show an ID difficulty score, and that's something that originates from a project that the National Biodiversity Network originally set up called Record Cleaner. And one of the things that that project did was to come up with a set of guidelines for how difficult species are to identify. So, and the scoring goes from number 1, which are the easiest to identify and the ones that you would typically expect to be able to do in the field, right the way up to number 5, which are the species that you would typically need to have a specimen, and sometimes you would need to dissect that specimen, and sometimes you might need to send it off to a specialist to get it confirmed. So it's that 1 from easy to 5 to difficult. But they're not hard and fast rules. I mean, they're the rules are implemented in iRecord as well, and you'll often see little messages popping up about the fact that a species is in one or other of those categories. And generally, to do things from photos, you would expect them to be in sort of categories 1 or 2 or perhaps 3. But it does all depend on the photo, and if you get exactly the right angle, you can quite often do the 3 and 4 difficulty species from photos if the photo shows exactly the right thing. So these rules aren't entirely cut and dried, but they are there to sort of give an indication of whether you're likely to need to go to that extra length to get a species identified.
Yeah, I think they're very useful guidance in iRecord, especially if you accidentally type in something wrong and it's sort of a good alert, or you think you've got something and it's a good alert to just tell you to check it again, really. Certainly. So another question from Carlos R. Is the adult downlooker snipefly a predator? The way it sits on trees looks rather similar to what long-legged flies of the genus Sciopus do. Yep,
I can see that similarity. The downlookers are quite a lot bigger than those Sciopus flies, but they do have quite a similar structure to them. I've never seen them catch any prey, and I'm not aware of it being documented, although I'd love to be put right on that if anybody does know anything about it. And I would absolutely love if anybody has actually seen them doing any predatory behavior and attacking other species. As I say, it's not something I've ever been able to see myself, as I said, the snipeflies are a group that we really don't know very much about what their ecology is, and there's real scope there if you see these flies and you've got a bit of time to spend some time really observing them closely, it would be fascinating to learn more about what they do actually get up to.
Great. Carlos says, awesome, thanks. Okay, on to a question from Liam Crowley. How likely is it that anthrax is turning up after being imported with commercially produced osmia from Europe?
That is certainly a potential route for that. And when Rob Mills found the first one, I did discuss that with people at Bee Wars. I think Mike Edwards and Stuart Roberts from Bee Wars, we had a bit of discussion about that, and they didn't think that it was a very likely route because they didn't think that there was actually that much traffic in the bee nests between the continent and here, but it does remain a possibility. And of course, when these species do sort of turn up in new places for no obvious reason, you always have to bear in mind that they might have well, they could have just got on the back of a truck and got moved in any case, regardless of any connection with bee hotels. So it is a mystery, and the Cambridgeshire location might suggest some sort of artificial help was involved. The Canterbury location is perhaps a bit more logical for a species that's expanding on the continent and has made its own way across. So potentially that's a more natural looking colonisation. But of course, it's still odd that it's only turned up in this very one place. So that also might lead us to think that it's been somehow assisted in getting there. But as ever, we just don't have any definitive evidence to say one way or the other at the moment.
Right, okay, a question from Trevor Southwood. I have some to record from earlier this year, mostly common species, I imagine. Do you still want them placing on iRecord?
Yes, please. If the only reason not to put something on iRecord is if you're really not sure of the identification, and if you've got a photo, then it would be really good to go to the Facebook page or to Twitter or wherever, or to get one of your local experts to help you. But as long as you're confident of the identification, then yeah, please do add it to iRecord. We are very interested in common species as well as rare, because it all helps us monitor how things are changing and to look at those flight period changes and distribution changes as well. What was the other thing I was going to say? And also, it doesn't matter when the records are, the fact that they're not necessarily terribly recent is also not a reason not to put them in. So as you saw from that coverage map, there are still relatively few records. Even though we're getting more and more records, there's still a lot of places where we don't actually know very much in any particular local area about what these species are doing. So yeah, yes, please, to records.
Okay, we'll go to a hand up from the floor now. Mark Taylor, would you like to unmute yourself?
Evening, Martin. I just wanted to share with people that at the moment they start seeing the bee flies on the wing, if they also have a patch of earth that they can see mining bees coming out of, just spend a bit of time looking carefully amongst the mining bee holes for the telltale pupil or the exuvia cases, which are really easy to identify with the Brit Ensock book. And you know, you can get them not only to genus, but you can do them to gender as well. And I just take out my Swiss Army knife, just dig it in slightly adjacent to the exuvial skin, and just lever it out and pop it in a glass tube, bring them home, and they really are easy to deal with and also store, and then stick them on iRecord as we've done.
Okay, we'll go to a question now from Dean Lee Evans of Keystone NHPF of the USA. Has there been any scientific study if the Channel Tunnel has resulted in easier transmission of mainland European insects into the UK?
That's a very good question, and I don't really have any answer to it. It's not something I've ever seen anything written about. So I don't know whether anybody else on the call knows about this. I could certainly imagine it as a possibility, although I guess lorries and containers have been coming backwards and forwards into this country for a long time before the Channel Tunnel existed, but perhaps the Channel Tunnel allows it to happen more quickly. But that's all speculation on my part. I just don't know, but it certainly seems plausible.
And I suppose it could be going the opposite way as well. Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I'm sure there must have been something. I suppose there's a range of different traps you could put at either other end and probably detect oddities quite quickly. Yeah, it's a good question. So, okay, a question from Pigeon. What are the little snipe's long stilt legs for?
You've just given yourself another lovely project that you can all go and investigate. And again, I just don't know. And I've not seen, when I've been observing them, I've not seen any sort of thing that seems to require them to have long legs. They don't seem to sort of bounce up and down on them the way some crane flies do. They don't seem to use them to grab hold of things, and they don't really seem to need them to sort of pick their way through the undergrowth. You often see them sitting on sort of fairly bare surfaces. So, yeah, very interesting question. Another one that I can't answer, I'm afraid.
Okay, we'll move on to a question from Tracy Money. Are eye patterns in horseflies accurate for ID, or should they only be a guide?
They are very useful for narrowing down identification to a smaller number of possibilities. There aren't very many completely unique patterns in the horsefly eyes. But as I say, they certainly do reduce the possibilities. So if you're looking at genus Tavanus, for instance, some of them have no bands, some have one band, some have multiple bands. So it's really, really useful information. And the other thing about it is that if you're keeping specimens, the eye banding does not survive in the dead specimens. So it's really useful and important to either take a photo of the living specimen before you collect a specimen, if that's what you're doing, or to make a written description of it. So it definitely helps with the identification, but I don't think, off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples where you could definitively identify a single species just on its eye pattern.
Okay, so don't just zoom in on the eyes to get a nice photograph. Take
No,
a picture
and
of
for
the whole beast as
horseflies,
well.
yeah, for horseflies, you need the eyes, you need a really detailed close-up of the antennae, you need the abdomen colours, which are usually hidden under the wings, and you need to know what all the bristles are doing on the legs. So they are quite a challenge for photo ID, but it can be done sometimes. And certainly Andy Grayson, who's been doing the surveys for you, is absolutely brilliant at picking out the species, and he's the sort of ultimate authority on this.
Okay, great. So we'll go on to a question from Jill. Any tips on catching/trapping these flies? I'm not sure if Jill was referring to just the whole group of Soldierflies and allies. I presume so. But Jill, if it was more specific than that, then just unmute yourself and say or write it in the chat.
Okay. Yes, it was just in general. If there's any clever tips on trapping, perhaps.
Yeah.
Species.
One of the things that I find quite interesting about the group is that because there are so many different habitat specializations within them, it's actually quite hard to go to any one place and see lots of them all at the same time. So the challenge is not so much about trapping techniques as the fact that you do need to visit lots of really nice places and different habitat types if you want to see a good range of the species. And obviously there are some trapping techniques such as those Manitoba traps that we were looking at for the horseflies that are specific to them. And some of the species will turn up in things like Malaise traps and the pan traps that people sometimes use. But to be honest, most of the recording of these flies is done by sweep netting. That's probably the single most effective technique for the widest range of species. And there are little peculiarities like some of the, do you remember that there was that larva of the awl fly, AWL, the awl fly, which is associated with, which develops under the bark of decaying wood. And some of those flies, the only way to find the adults is to find a suitable tree and then watch for the adults flying up and down the tree. So there are some sort of, as with all species groups, really little bits of sort of field technique that you have to get to grips with to find particular species. So yeah, I think rather than there's no sort of one method or one approach, you do need to read up on the species, go to their habitats and find out find a way of targeting them. But it's not really so much about trapping, as I say, it's about getting to grips with their behavior and going and looking for them as much as anything else.
Great, okay, I'll go to a question from Chris Cools. The black soldier fly is known to outcompete other flies in their growth substrate? What impact do you foresee in nature?
Well, at the moment, well, last time I looked into this, which is a while ago now, it was still assumed and believed, and well, not just believed, there was evidence to show that the black soldier fly does not have suitable climate conditions in the UK to enable it to sustain a wild population. So until such time as we learn otherwise, and of course these things do have a habit of going off the rails when we don't expect it, but at the moment it's not regarded as a threat to native wildlife. I wasn't aware of that information about the competition within the soil situation, and so that presumably is a potential problem in those parts of the world that do have suitable climate conditions for the soldier fly, for the black soldier fly. So it is, I guess, a potential concern if it was to become established in the UK, but at the moment, fingers crossed, it doesn't feel like it's sort of at the top of the things to be worried about list.
But Martin, you don't know of anywhere else in the world where it's considered a threat because the climatic conditions are suitable and there's lots of people breeding them for these.
I don't, but I'm afraid I'm very focused on my UK recording scheme, and I'm not very good at keeping up with what happens elsewhere. So it's not something I've looked into to any great extent, I'm afraid.
Okay, so a question from the chat from Dave Skinsley. Docks are interesting areas for some unusual insects. Has Kent Ento Group got info on it? So yeah, they might have. I would just say that in terms of docks, Liverpool, of course, is famous for its docks, and there are many specimens in the World Museum collections, some quite enormous tropical beetles, amongst other things, that have come out of the Liverpool docks. I don't know if they used to have a relationship with the people at the docks, so they knew where to take these unusual things arriving, but it doesn't seem to happen anymore. I'll leave Martin if he knows anything about the Kent group.
I don't know anything about the Kent situation specifically. All I would say is that, as we mentioned earlier on, quite a lot of these species have larvae that are in the soil, and therefore there is a lot of potential for them getting moved around with the horticultural trade and no doubt other routes as well. We saw what was probably an example of that was written up in the Diptris Digest fairly recently, where one of the Dioptria robberflies was found, I think it was in the Hebrides, which is a long way north of its expected range, and it also emerged very early in the year compared to what it does in normal conditions. And the likelihood is that there was a larva that had got transported in a plant pot, basically. Can't prove it, as is so often the case, but that seemed to be the most plausible explanation for that one. And that might have been a movement just within the UK, but equally there do seem to be possibilities for that to happen more extensively. And in a way, I suppose it's surprising that we haven't seen more exotic species turning up via those routes. So whether that means it's not as big a problem as we might fear, I don't know, or whether it just means that these things get overlooked.
Yeah, I just got one.
Yeah.
I'll put my hand up for it. I just wondered, as Martin's got the UK focus, where would we go to deal with perhaps some European ones when we're away? Because I've certainly seen a few on some of the Canary Islands and some of the Balearic Islands, some nice bee flies and the rest of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, I don't think I have so many particularly good answers for that. I mean, the iNaturalist, which I don't make much use of in the UK, but iNaturalist obviously is used worldwide, and there are some very helpful people on there in terms of sort of putting things in as records. And there are obviously taxonomic specialists elsewhere in Europe and many other countries, of course, some of whom I'm in touch with. I tend to know the Northern European people a little bit better. There's a lot of work been done in Scandinavia and some good publications come out of there, for instance. So there potentially are people to get in touch with. And just as a purely random example, I know that Dave Gibbs, who's a very expert UK-based entomologist, has a particular interest in bee flies further south in the Mediterranean area. So that, yeah, there are some possibilities there, but and there are some other people within Dipteris Forum who take much more of an interest in European entomology than I've had a chance to do. And people like Darwin Sumner, for instance, within the Dipteris Forum, has some very good links elsewhere on the continent. So I think probably the best advice I could give you would be to contact Dipteris Forum, and I'd perhaps put a question on the Dipteris Forum website, or contact one of the committee members, and we'll see what we can do via that route if you're looking for help in that direction. And inevitably, I see that that's raised the question about iNaturalist records in the UK. At the moment, I'm afraid I just don't get time to ever look at iNaturalist. So at the moment, those records aren't coming through to me if people do use iNaturalist. But I'm well aware that iNaturalist does have some very good features, and that people are putting their records on there. Last time I looked, there were a tiny proportion of records on iNaturalist compared to the large number that we're getting coming through iRecord. And as I say, at the moment, I've not sort of been able to do anything with the iNaturalist ones. But we did have for a while, we were bringing iNaturalist records into iRecord in order to make them available to recording schemes. And although that in the end had to be stopped for various reasons, it is an issue that's still here, and it is an issue that's still being looked at. And it is possible that if we can get it to work well enough, that the iNaturalist records will start to make a link with iRecord again at some point in the not too distant future. Can't guarantee it yet, but it's, as I say, it's certainly being looked at again.